Today I want to do something a little bit different and have a look at a single chapter in a handbook for leaders in higher education, with the sexy subtitle Transforming Teaching and Learning. So let's have a look at the guidance that's being offered to the most senior people in our institutions and see if it fits the criteria that we often ask of in universities. Is it research informed? Is it evidence based? Are the references up to date? So here we have chapter 8, Leading Change. The author of the handbook is Professor Stephanie Marshall. At the time of writing, she was the chief executive of the Higher Education Academy. I'm going to talk you through what is a fairly short chapter and offer some commentary, critical commentary I should add, on some of the elements. I think we'll do that as I go along. So let's delve into the chapter. So the first substantive element you come to in this chapter is billed as 13 pointers for leading institutional change. So it's Professor Marshall referencing her own work, the 2007 book she did on similar issues. In this book she came up with 13 pointers, and they're fairly generic, but to give you a flavour of them, it's about develop a clear vision, it's about distributed leadership, ongoing constant communication, celebrating early successes, planning for continuous improvement. So that's what's in the chapter. My concerns would be as follows. I went back to the 2007 book because I was genuinely interested in the theoretical framework underpinning the pointers that university leaders were being encouraged to use. There were two main references which were relied on very heavily, both of them Harvard Business School professors. One was Professor John Kotter, who crops up later, and the other was Professor Kotter, another Harvard professor. Where I'm uneasy is the Kotter book was a 96 book, and the Kotter book, which was co-authored with two other authors, was a 92 book. In the 92 book, the authors argue for 10 commandments for leading change, and Professor Kotter argues for 8 steps to lead change. In neither instance where these sources research formed, theory formed, they were more offering a view based on what was happening in American businesses at the beginning of the 90s. So we tend to treat these sources with a lot of caution. Anyway, in the chapter they form the basis of the underpinning for the 13 pointers, and I would be concerned about that. In the 2007 book, Professor Marshall suggests that it is legitimate to take ideas from the business world and apply them to higher education. I would have concerns about that. I think it's a very different national context. I think it's a very different sectoral context. I think it's 30 years ago. I think there's technological changes, there's movements in societies, there's all sorts of reasons why I would be very uneasy with the path that university leaders are explicitly being encouraged to follow here. If we move on, we then see that the bulk of the chapter is case studies of how senior leaders in universities successfully led change. So 3 descriptive cases, not research-based cases, but descriptive accounts of how these leaders led changes in their respective institutions. So I'm not going to get into them. As I say, we wouldn't use those as a basis for developing a theory. They're more about accounts of practice. What is slightly troubling is, having gone through those, we've almost got to the end of the chapter. We have this section summary here, and there is a little bit towards the end of that summary. It reads, all three institutional change initiatives were successful, with success being achieved through visible academic leadership combined with distributed leadership, which promoted the engagement of the whole institutional community. We need to be cautious when evaluating change. What success for one person might be failure for another. So, for instance, an institution could embark upon a very deep redundancy programme where staff lost their livelihoods. In some quarters, that might be seen as successful. If you ask the women and men who'd lost their jobs, they might not see it as a successful change initiative. So we need to be careful about these accounts by leaders of how successfully they believed they led change. It comes up a lot in the works of the likes of Professor Kotter and other Harvard professors, but if we were looking at this in a rigorous way, we'd say be very cautious. This isn't really what we mean by research in a university. Moving on, if I push the book up a bit, we've got at the bottom there a reference to further reading, and Professor Kotter's book is plugged very, very strongly. If we read it out, it says, if readers have not read this classic, they're the words used, which has been updated a number of times, this book highlights and illustrates Kotter's 8-point approach to leading change, which is then summarised. Right. I'll come back at the end of this video to my concerns about Professor Kotter's work, because it's one of my pet peeves. But what I would say is it hasn't been updated a number of times. There was a 2012 new edition of the book that did come out, but Professor Kotter himself says he didn't change a word in the body of the book. He just added a new preface. By way of a defence, he says the 96 beliefs, ideas he shared then are still as relevant today as they were back then. I would challenge that and say there have been advances in gender, race equality. There have been moves towards more ethical approaches to leading and managing change. There have been technological shifts. There's been a recession. There's been 101 things that have happened since '96. So please don't tell me that 96 account of leading change is still relevant, and please don't tell me it's been updated a number of times, because enough. Moving on, up at the top of the page you have the 8 steps. I'm sure some of you have lived through them. The language has seeped into all sorts of organisations. I should add this approach is very popular amongst business leaders, so don't be surprised if you hear this talk. It doesn't mean it has any merit. It's just the lexicon of American businesses from back in the 90s, which is being transported into the future. And remember, this book was billed as being forward-looking, so perhaps it is in that sense. There is then a self-citation. In effect, Professor Marshall, for further reading, recommends going back and reading her 2007 book, but I've shared my concerns there about the theoretical framing of leading change, so I won't go over them. We've then got a reference to a website for Harvard Business School and Harvard Business School's practitioner magazine, Harvard Business Review, where in it Professor Kotter offers 10 reasons people resist change. If I read the words out to you, another classic, I should add that's according to Professor Marshall, another classic with the premise being that leadership is about change. Yet what is a leader to do when faced with ubiquitous resistance? Resistance to change manifests itself in many ways, from diffidence, foot dragging and inertia, to petty sabotage or outright rebellion. So here we have a very offensive stereotype. We, in universities, and this applies to leaders of universities as well as staff, we try to avoid generalising on any grounds. So a stereotype of all the staff being resistors to change is offensive. Equally, a gender stereotype, a racist stereotype, they are bad academic practice in this book that claims to offer us excellence. We must get away from stereotyping people. In terms of resistance, the debates have moved on considerably. If you look at any of the organisational change textbooks, they will show how we've got a far better understanding of resistance. There are occasions when good women, good men resist change for good reasons. They believe it's not in the best interests of students or themselves or their institutions. And we need that if we're to move forward in times of change. But that's lost when you start promoting offensive stereotypes of all employees. It really doesn't help the leaders. And what deeply troubles me is leaders reading this are being offered an approach which goes against the values of some of the better universities. If we move on, we come to the references, and I'm awfully sorry to disappoint you here. You probably guessed it, there aren't any really. There are 2 references at the end. So one is another reference to Professor Kotter. He's attributed with writing the Heart of Change book, but if you try and find it, you won't find it because it was a co-authored book. So he co-authored the book with a business consultant by the name of Dan Cohen. In that book, they talked to business leaders about how they'd successfully employed the leading change steps in their business practice, and they offer anecdotal accounts of how change was led in different parts of the world. So how relevant that is to leading change in the very particular context of a higher education sector, I really don't know. But I guess if you like Kotter, it's another Kotter reference. And then the final reference, again, it's the author suggesting reading the 2007 book. And I've talked about that, so I'm not going to bang on about that. Okay, let's get back and a few final words to camera. We had a look inside the handbook for HE leaders, and as you could probably tell, I was troubled by what I saw. There is a lot of change and transformation going on within our higher education institutions, and that will continue to go on. I no longer work in higher education, but when I did, I was very much aware that it was happening, and it's an ongoing process. I would always hope that we would believe in the knowledge, the research, the scholarship within universities and use that to inform how we led change. I was troubled when I delved into the handbook and found out that these handbook for our most senior leaders didn't seem to have faith in the knowledge they were responsible for in a way. So when the book talks about responding to the need of universities to take the lead in changing cultures and working practices, this book is an essential and forward-looking text for both scholars and practitioners. Those words ring hollow. There's an assumption that the leaders are the solution and the staff are the problem. I don't see it as that black and white. I really don't. I better not say any more about that. But again, when it says this is an essential text for scholars and practitioners, I don't believe it is. If I was a scholar, or if I knew of a scholar studying and using this book to study leading change in universities, I would be troubled. All of the things that we're so passionate about are missing from this slightly sleazy account of leading change. My biggest concern, though, is the emphasis on this book. It's a bestseller, it's sold many copies, but as I say, it wasn't updated. When I used to write chapters, I used to become uneasy even when I wrote about this book, and that drove me to write a paper, Leading Changes, Why Transformation Explanations Fail. And that paper thankfully was published in the Sage Journal Leadership in 2016. I'll put a reference in the description. So on that slightly doomy note, I will sign off. Thank you.